It's about growing up in
All right, folks, I want to thank everybody for coming out today to celebrate Jack Kerouac's 104th birthday with us at Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. And of course, before we even get started, I want to thank our gracious hosts at LaLa Books, Laura, and the entire team community around the love of literature and the exchange of ideas, the old-fashioned idea of discourse, right? It's a beautiful thing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
And we are going to jump into the program in just a moment. I have two wonderful speakers who are going to get us kicked off to start things up. Before we do, I just want to say who I am. I'm Mike Flynn. I'm the current president of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. We got some material over here on the table if you want to check it out. We do a festival every October. That's our big thing that we do every year. And we are a group that started with the basic movement to get the Kerouac commemorative at Jack Kerouac Park established here in the city way back. It started in about 1986 and was dedicated in 1988. They did a festival for the dedication, and we've been doing an annual festival in Lowell around Jack Kerouac ever since. So that's who we are and what we do. You can check us out at lowellcelebateskerouac.org. But this is, of course, a celebration of Jack's birthday, which was just on Thursday. And I am very happy to hand it off to my predecessor in the president's role at Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, a guy I met in 2002 when I came back from California. I was born and raised in Lowell, but I came back and I was getting ready to go back into school, so I took a class at Lowell, just non-matriculated student in the literature of the Beat Generation. And it was taught by the Reverend Steve Edington, who was teaching the class at that time. And ever since then, I've been getting more and more involved with this group, and it's really been a fantastic thing. And Steve's work that we are going to be hearing today, The Gospel According to Jack, Tracking Kerouac in My Life, is another piece in a body of work that has been near and dear to my heart. Particularly his book, The Beat Face of God, is one that was very important to me at a very critical time in my life. And so I love to see the output, and I'm so glad that at Lowell Celebrates Kerouac and LaLa Books were able to put this event on to, get some more of his work out. So Reverend Stephen Edington will be reading from his new book, The Gospel According to Jack, and then we will have a response from Dr. Keith B. Mitchell from the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He's an associate professor in English and Humanities and several other things, right? I met him last October. He participated in some of our events during the festival, and he's a phenomenal talent to have in the city, and he's very generous with his time and talent. And so without any further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Steve Edington and Keith Mitchell for a little bit of a deep dive into who am I this lilac evening. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Mike. I want to join with you in thanking Laura and the LaLa Books for hosting this event. This is a fantastically wonderful bookstore, which is why we, Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, we like to give it whatever kind of support we have. Well, in addition to celebrating Jack, if you're up on the news, which I imagine most of you are, the scroll, the On the Road scroll, has been purchased by Zach Bryan, and we're hoping, if things go the way we hope they go, it will eventually find itself a permanent home here in Lowell. That story is still unfolding, which means I don't want to speculate too much on where it could be. But to mark the occasion, knew I was going to be here, I decided I'd wear the T-shirt. Believe it or not, you can get the entire text of On the Road on a T-shirt, believe it or not. Also, here's the scroll coming out of the typewriter. So I figured this would be the day to do that. A little bit about why I came to write this book. It's my third Kerouac themed book, and every book I've done, I've said this is the last one I'm going to write because of all that's involved with it. Then I end up coming out with another one. But what I want to do, I'll get to the chapter I want to share from here in just a minute. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was I decided I wanted to bring together my minister life and my Kerouac life. As most of you know, I'm a retired Unitarian Universalist minister. I had the UU Church up in Nashville, New Hampshire for 24 years. I came there in 1988 By that time, I had read most of the works of Kerouac that were available in 1988. Much come out since then. And I realized, hey, I'm living just a little ways north of Lowell, Massachusetts, Jack's hometown. And then I found out the guy who happened to be the chair of the English department at UMass Lowell at that time, Bill Roberts, was a member of my congregation. And he said, well, there's these people down in Lowell you might want to get to know. And so that was how I became involved with Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. One of the first people I met was Roger Brunel, very graciously welcomed me into that organization. Rest in peace. And then Paul Marion here was another person that helped get me into Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. So after all these years, here we still are. So anyway, as far as the book goes, when I said I wanted to bring together my ministry life and my Kerouac's life, I realized as I read this, and this came out, and I tried to say this also in the book that Mike mentioned, that Deep Face of God, where there are a number of religious spiritual themes in the writings of Kerouac. So I thought, what if I were to come up with a series of homilies or meditations or sermons, if you want to call them that, that would, instead of being based on some more of the traditional works of Scripture, what if I were to take a passage from one of Jack Kerouac's writings and then do a homily about it? Same as if I were doing a sermon, our text for today is Jack Kerouac's whatever, and then go on with it. So I actually got 10 chapters out of that, and what I'm going to read this evening, it's the second chapter is titled "A White Man Disillusioned," or "Who Am I on this lilac evening?" One reason I wanted to do this, and Mike mentioned that we LCK we had some pre-festival events over at UMass Lowell, looking at his model pick and some of the racial themes in that. And I looked at the conversation that generated, and Dr. Mitchell was a part of that. So I thought, well, maybe I'll bring my Lilac Evening chapter into here. So without me babbling on anymore, I'm going to get into it. This runs, I time myself, maybe a little, about 20 minutes and change, and then Dr. Mitchell will offer his response. And here's the passage from On the Road. That lilac evening, I walked with every muscle aching in the Denver colored section, wishing I were a Negro, feeling that the best the white world offered was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough light, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough night. I stopped in a little shack where a man sold red-hot chili in paper containers. I bought some and ate it, strolling in the dark, mysterious streets. I wished I were a Denver Mexican, or even a Fort Worth Jap. Anything but what I was so drearily, a white man, disillusioned. All my life I'd had white ambitions. A gang of colored women came by, and one of the young ones detached herself from her mother-like elders and came to me fast. "Hello, Joe!" And suddenly she saw it wasn't Joe and ran back blushing. I was only myself, Sal Paradise, sad, strolling in this violet dark, this unbearably sweet night, wishing I could exchange words with the happy, true-hearted, ecstatic Negroes of America. And now, the sermon. To read these words more than half a century after they were published, and in the face of today's racial climate in America, can cause even the most devout Kerouac aficionado to feel a sense of embarrassment. Taking on their own, his sentiments come off as nothing more than romanticized racism on the part of a hopelessly naive, wannabe white guy who has little, if any, true knowledge of the African-American experience in this country. This was the charge leveled by one of Kerouac's most caustic critics, commentary editor Norman Podhoretz, who noted in an essay shortly after On the Road came out, there would certainly come as news to the Negroes of America circa 1949 that they were happy, true-hearted, and ecstatic. Taken strictly on its own, Podhoretz's point certainly has truth to it, but his put-down of Kerouac was contained in a sneering, look-down-his-nose essay called The Know-Nothing Bohemians, in which Podhoretz accused Kerouac and his Beat Generation contemporaries of being the avowed enemies of all that was right, good, proper, and decent about civilized America in the 1950s. Many years later, in the 2019 issue of The American Mind, an 89-year-old Podhoretz extols the virtues of Donald Trump as one who truly makes America great. If nothing else, give Podhoretz credit for consistency, even if it's completely, hideously, and consistently wrong-headed. Given past, and Podhoretz, okay, rest in peace, he passed away about a year or so ago. Getting past Podhoretz is true on the surface, but completely off the point observation. I think the key to understanding this passage lies in looking beyond Kerouac's embarrassing racial naivete to what he was really struggling with on that Denver lilac evening in 1949. It has to do with the exterior and the interior landscapes of On the Road. While the exterior landscape of On the Road is the geography and the people of America in the late 1940s, the interior landscape is the soul of Kerouac's persona, Sal Paradise, as he struggles with the question we all encounter at one time or another in our lives, usually most strongly in our coming-of-age years. Who am I? This, I feel, is what largely accounts for the ongoing popularity and the relevance of On the Road. It's a classic coming-of-age novel. It's about looking beyond oneself when it comes to developing an identity of one's own. And this is what Kerouac's Sal Paradise is doing. Paradise feels that the key to the who am I question is out there somewhere on the road. As I hope to show in this chapter, Kerouac Paradise is half right. For many people, myself included, the path to self-discovery does lead outward. We may not do it just like Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty do, but in one way or another, we all want to get on the road at some point, usually in our younger days. But the path to self-discovery does not just lead outward. It means going deep inside as well. This is why I say Kerouac's Paradise is half right in searching for himself and in seeking his soul on the road. At some point, as Kerouac himself discovers, one has to come home and turn inward. With this perspective, let's return to the Lilac Evening passage. Read it against the racial backdrop of the America of 1949. Read it as you reflect upon an America whose white population preferred to forget about the black and brown men and women who had served their country, and many who lost their lives just a few years earlier in World War II. Read it as you think of a white America who wanted to relegate its people of color back to their invisibility, make that back to their non-personhood of the pre-World War II era. The message was, thanks for your service, now let's get back to our racial apartheid. At roughly the same time that Kerouac was taking his walk through Denver's colored section, as he called it, William Levitt was literally and figuratively shaping the physical and cultural landscape of post-World War II America by building one of the country's first cookie-cutter suburbs in Levittown, Long Island, New York. For a telling indicator of the place's status of persons of color in the United States had to stop to get back to normal, try these stark words in the agreement that the returning American GIs had to sign as they bought their homes in Levittown. Quote, the tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. Unquote. For suburban America. That was what you had to sign to get in. One can only wonder if among those returning white GIs who signed that agreement were some who owed their lives to the heroic actions taken in combat by a fellow soldier who was other than a member of the Caucasian race. Think on these things, as you also think about a 27-year-old white man, himself a World War II veteran, U.S. merchant marine, still trying to figure out who he is and where his niche in life would be. By now, many of Kerouac's fellow World War II vets were attending and graduating from college on the GI Bill. This bill was a laudatory move by the United States Congress, and those vets were clearly deserving of its benefits. And one outcome of the GI Bill, for good or for ill, was that it helped groom those veterans for the roles they would play in the emerging corporate culture of the America of the 1950s, men in the gray flannel suits. This was the route, and this was the script that Kerouac could not follow. While he was not born to privilege, the door to privilege had opened to him. Even as he walked through that so-called colored section of Denver, Jack was aware that he himself had grown up in an ethnic section of Lowell, Massachusetts, in its French-Canadian enclaves. Like those whom he encountered on his Denver stroll, Kerouac grew up aware of a dominant culture to which he and his family did not belong. He didn't even speak the language of the dominant culture until he was 6 years old. But a door opened. It was a door that largely remained closed to persons of color in the late 1930s, but one that opened for a white guy, however, quote, disadvantaged his family situation in life made it. Thanks to athletic prowess, Jack scored a football scholarship to an Ivy League university. He went from the cramped quarters of Lowell's working-class French-Canadian neighborhoods New York's Upper West Side and the Columbia University campus. He embodied the fulfillment of every immigrant parent's dream. Both of his parents were born in rural areas of Quebec before finding their way to Lowell by way of Nashua and New Hampshire. They held fast to the idea and the promise that if I work hard and struggle and sacrifice, that our children will make good in America. When Kerouac later wrote Maggie Cassidy, which draws on his years at Lowell High School, he describes his mother, Gabrielle Kerouac's thoughts, as her son sets off for college in New York after getting the Columbia Scholarship. Maggie Cassidy, my mother was positive in her secret heart that I was to become a big executive of insurance companies. Just like when I made my first confession, I was a little angel of pure future. Such was the classic immigrant parent's dream. I was to become a big executive of insurance companies. This was the ticket his Columbia Scholarship held out for him. It was a ticket that would give him entree into the dominant, white, well-educated, economically secure culture of his day. And Jack handed the ticket back. When in the fall of 1942, Kerouac dropped out of Columbia, thereby forfeiting his scholarship, I believe there was considerably more going on than a dispute with his football coach over a lack of playing time. Maybe it was an unconscious decision, but in leaving Columbia's prestigious arena, Jack was also returning his ticket of admission to the respectable, upwardly mobile, career-oriented, if one was male, white, suburban America of the 1950s. A degree which he was quite capable of earning from one of America's premier universities would have clearly given him entrance into that world. Whatever identity Kerouac was seeking, however, this was not it. At the age of 27, Gabrielle Kerouac's little angel of pure future was nowhere near the office of an insurance executive. Instead, he was walking and searching in the streets of Denver, in its colored section, as he called it, still trying to figure out who he was and where he belonged. So after handing back his ticket, Kerouac set out to look for a milieu where he could, he felt, discover who he was. He struck up camaraderies with people who were feeling a similar kind of alienation and disaffection as he was. Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs, Lucian Carr, E.D. Parker, who became his first wife, Joan Vollmer Adams, and others. He chose to be among the fringe, and the sometimes outlaw folk of New York's Times Square, like the street hustler Herbert Huncke, or among those who frequented the jazz clubs of Harlem. In seeking his identity, Kerouac chose to conduct his search among those who lived on the margins of society. Among the various definitions of beat, a term Kerouac, along with John Cleland Holmes, helped to coin, was one that referred to those who had been beaten down or beaten out to the edges of mainstream society and culture. This certainly included the non-white cultures. Perhaps Kerouac felt that this was a stance in which he could best pursue his self-identity. And while the term beat often referred to social, economic, or cultural estrangement, it primarily referred to spiritual estrangement or alienation. It was spiritual estrangement that Kerouac was feeling as he walked among Denver's colored population in the spring of 1949. In recalling that experience while later sitting at his typewriter, as he tries to get it all down on paper in a 3-week writing burst, he refers to himself as a white man disillusioned, and writes that the best the white world has to offer was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough life, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough light, not enough night. Strange as it may sound, I don't think Kerouac is primarily making a literal racial reference here. Well, okay, yes he is, to be sure, but he's doing more than that. He's seeking a way of saying that he didn't find any kind of personal fulfillment in the dominant culture of his day with its white institutions and attitudes. So what comes off in reading the words today as an embarrassingly naive romanticizing of African Americans, a term not used at that time, is Kerouac projecting his own spiritual needs onto a multifaceted culture about which he actually knows very little, but with which he seeks an identity. In his own way, Jack knew that Black Lives Matter. He just didn't know how or what Black Lives Mattering had to do with him. The only words he could come up with are the ones in this passage. However, they may miss the mark. Rightly, they may miss the mark. As Jack Kerouac, in the persona of South Paradise, took his Denver walk, he was taking one of the many steps and roads he would travel on his journey of meaning and spirit. To take this theme a bit further, there's another line in this same passage where Kerouac admits he abandoned a good woman like Terry in the San Joaquin Valley. This harkens back to an earlier episode in On the Road, where he has a brief romance with a young Hispanic woman in Southern California. It captures the same phenomenon of Kerouac looking beyond his ethnicity and his whiteness for an identity. Sal meets Terry. Her real name is Bea Franklin, on a bus trip from San Francisco to Los Angeles on his first country, venture. Sal and Terry go from necking on the bus to finding a hotel room in Los Angeles to Sal moving in with Terry and her young son in the town of, he calls Selma, it's Selma, California, which is actually well to the north of LA. Terry and her family are Mexican laborers. Sal, Terry, and her young son pick cotton for $3 per 100 pounds picked, after they move into a tent in a trailer park near the cotton fields. For a few days, Kerouac's Paradise thinks he's actually found paradise. He writes, "My back began to ache, but it was beautiful. Kneeling and hiding in that earth, if I felt like resting, I did, with my face on the pillow of the brown, moist earth. Birds sang an accompaniment. I thought I'd found my life's work." Here again, Kerouac romanticizes a culture with which he has very little familiarity, but with which he wishes to connect. And when Sal learns that some Okies tied a man, presumably Mexican, to a tree and beat him to a pulp, he takes precautions of his own. "From then on, I carried a big stick with me in the tent in case they got the idea that we Mexicans were fouling up their trailer camp. They thought I was a Mexican, of course, and in a way I am. Well, but in a more pronounced way, Kerouac was not. His reference to we Mexicans notwithstanding. In time, his aching back becomes more of an issue to him than the brown, moist earth. He quickly discovers that Terry's little boy can pick cotton faster than he can. Sal finally decides it's time for him to go home. Among the many memorable lines in On the Road, which has kind of become the motto of Lowell Celebrates Kerouac, among the many memorable lines in On the Road is the one where Kerouac writes about his feelings that his Southern California days are winding down. Everybody goes home in October. And where was home? In Kerouac's case, it was Ozone Park in Queens, New York, where his French-Canadian mother was living. Her primary language remained a version of French-Canadian French, which Jack and his mother used when they conversed. His father, Leo, had already passed away. Everybody goes home in October. You may search far and wide for who you are, but eventually you go home in October. Kerouac may have wished he were a Negro or fancied himself as a Mexican, but his home was in neither setting. Sal and Terry make vague plans to meet in New York, even as they both know it will never happen. South Paradise walks away from his imagined life as a Mexican with the words, "Well, lack-a-day, I was on the road again. Who am I?" In the midst of Kerouac's life and writings, there's a double-edged message in the midst of his struggles with this question. As we strive to create an identity that is uniquely our own, we're not completely tied to the social and cultural setting into which we were born, but neither do we completely escape or transcend it. Just as we have to live within the paradox of needing both security and freedom, we also have to live in the tension between the identity or script that we are given and the one towards which we aspire. And living within that push and pull is part of the spiritual journey. The mistake Kerouac makes, as reflected in On the Road, is that he seems to feel that in order for him to acquire an authentic identity, he has to become someone or something other than who he is. Yes, there was a part of Jack Kerouac that could make the connection with those with whom he sought to identify. But at the same time, he cannot completely empty himself into someone else's life and world. In the end, his disillusionment was not really about his being a white man as such, but rather it was his frustration in feeling that in order to reach beyond his white self, he has to deny that self. He gets caught in a breach. He's reaching for an identity, which in the end he cannot fully possess. But we should not overlook the beauty and the poignancy that came out of the breach in which Kerouac struggled. At a time when most of white America wanted to keep its African American population in the Jim Crow conditions of pre-World War II, Jack saw a life and a vibrancy in that population that would not remain oppressed or suppressed for much longer. Just a few years later, Martin Luther King evoked the life and the vibrancy he knew about in the African American church to help shape the civil rights movement. At a time when most Americans did not know about, much less see, the labor of the brown hands and backs that put food on their tables and clothes on their backs, Jack Kerouac, if only for a brief time, worked the fields of Southern California. In time, those brown hands and bodies and souls will be accorded a measure of hope and dignity and respect due to the organizing efforts of Cesar Chavez, who was deeply motivated by his Catholic faith. However much he may have misinterpreted, however much he may have romanticized what he saw and heard among the persons of color of his day, Jack Kerouac at least had the eyes to see and the ears to hear. Kerouac's reaching for an identity he did not fully possess was one of the many struggles of the soul and spirit he engaged in throughout his life. And out of that struggle comes one of the many gifts he left for us. He gave us his life, and he gave us the accounts of his life, in order that we may see the joys that can be found and the demons that may be encountered as we pursue the who am I question. Those who are familiar with Kerouac's life know the tragic turn it took in his later years. It was his abuse of alcoholism, among other things, that drove him back into some of the provinciality in which he'd been raised. By the time those with whom Jack had felt an affinity in the late 1940s began to find their voices and shake off their invisibility, Jack was no longer much interested in life, joy, and kicks. We should honor his life, nonetheless. We should honor Kerouac's willingness and his courage to push the who am I question as far as he did. We should honor his efforts to possess for himself something of what he saw and found among the dispossessed of his day. As tragically broken as his life became, he did, for a period in his life, glimpse the truth that his and our personal wholeness is inextricably linked to our larger connection with all of humanity. In saying, I wish I were a Negro or we Mexicans, I think Jack was reaching for that universal connection. It was a connection that ultimately eluded him. But for his very act of reaching out, we should bless him for his efforts. Such were the struggles of the soul and the spirit in which Jack Kerouac engaged throughout his life. That very struggle is one of his gifts to us. He gave us the accounts of his life. And even in their fictionalized form, they were Jack's very real struggles. He allowed us to see both the joys that can be found and the demons that can be encountered as we each pursue the who am I question for ourselves and seek out our own roads. For this we thank you. And I thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming today for this auspicious occasion. And I'd like to thank the Lowell Celebrates Kerouac group here, and I'd like to thank Steve and also, of course, LaLa Books for hosting this. They're wonderful. I want to start off by talking a little bit about my sort of introduction to Jack Kerouac, and also to talk about sort of go through this chapter, and I've got some notes here, sort of just give my general opinions about and ideas about what Steve has written. I've been at UMass Lowell as a literature professor for about 20 years now, and I teach American literature. I teach a survey course in American literature, starting with the Puritans and we all the way to the present, so it's like a selected greatest hits kind of class. And I also teach special topics courses in African American literature, as well as courses in the Harlem Renaissance and other courses like that. I am lucky to have so many colleagues who have been involved with Jack Kerouac since I've been at UMass Lowell. Hillary Holiday was the first person. She was a colleague at UMass Lowell and has written a lot on Jack Kerouac. She wrote the biography of Herbert Huncke. I don't know if any of you read that, but Hilary Holiday was a wonderful Kerouac scholar. Then of course there was Todd Teachin, who has really done so much to promote Kerouac and to get his name out there and to keep it going, keep Kerouac legacy going, especially the Library of America series that Professor Teachin, who's still at UMass Lowell, helped to put together. And then of course there's Mike Milner, an exceptional representative of UMass Lowell and the English department, and the amazing work that he has done with the Lowell Kerouac group. I have some really wonderful experiences, also being a part of several of the Lowell Kerouac, Celebrates Kerouac events over the last 15, 20 years. At Lowell High School, they have the poetry contest, and I was a judge for that contest for at least 5 years. And last October, I was thrilled to be asked to give a paper on Kerouac, or talk on Kerouac's last published novel, posthumously published novel, Pick. And that novel fascinated me. I had never read it before. I've read On the Road, and I've also taught Kerouac's play that was at the Merrimack Repertoire Center a number of years ago. Me and Todd Teachin and another colleague in the theater arts section of the English department, we put on some programming, really good programming for our students, and we all took them down there to see the play. But being asked to talk about Pick was fascinating to me, because I wondered why Kerouac would write a novel in which the protagonists are two African-American young people. Like Pick is 10 years old, his brother Slim is probably 16, 17 years old. Most of the novel, or a large chunk of the novel, takes place in the South. Kerouac attempts a Southern vernacular black dialect, which has gotten a lot of, it's been very controversial. It was wonderful writing that, giving that talk, but I also wrote a paper that is under review right now at the Arizona Quarterly. I don't know when that's coming out. It usually takes these things, it can take up to 2 years in terms of, being reviewed. But at any rate, it was a lot of fun writing that paper. One of the things I think I'm most proud of in reading Kerouac and teaching Kerouac and writing about Kerouac is that, I'm not an insider in terms of Kerouac scholarship, so I think I can come at it from a different perspective, or a fresh perspective, because I don't know all the background about Kerouac, right? So I can leave some of that biographical stuff at the door and just focus on the beauty of his work, focus on what he's doing formally in terms of how is he putting together his fiction, right? And that's one of the things I focused on in this paper that I wrote on Pick. Kerouac is a brilliant writer in many, many ways, and one of the things that I focused on in that paper was how his formal experimentation, how he uses different forms in that novel, different sentences, the way he capitalizes some words and doesn't capitalize other words, and what all that means in terms of his aesthetic as a writer. And I didn't focus so much on the biographical aspects of his life, except I did go down to the Center for Lowell History, and I looked through the Kerouac archive, and particularly looked at some of the materials that they had on that novel, the publication history of the novel, but also looking at just getting to know Kerouac better through his letters, through his journals, right, through some of the reviews of his books at the time. And it was absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I came away with was just how brilliant he was. He was one of the most well-read writers of his time than I can think of. And again, I teach American literature, especially that particular period in which Kerouac was teaching, 40s through the 60s, right? And so just reading about everything that he read, it's just astonishing to me that he would even have that much time to read as much as he did. He read everything, right? And I don't think a lot of people give him credit in terms of him being an intellectual. He was absolutely an intellectual, even though he gave the ticket back, you know, the Columbia ticket, he gave that back. But this man was an intellectual, very much so, and very, very smart. I want to start off by sort of deconstructing a little bit this opening paragraph, all right, this from On the Road, and to talk about how one of the main criticisms of this particular passage, and Steve talks about this in this chapter, is the romanticism. So this romanticized notion of what it means to be black and brown in this country in the late 1940s, early 50s. So, and I can see why critics would sort of take him to task for this. But one of the things I do tell my students, though, is that we have to make sure that we don't judge, use our present day standards and ideas about things like race and gender and things like in class, and sort of foist those on to the past and what writers did and what they wrote about in the past. I think it's important that we point these things out, but that's not what we should focus on. I think we should focus on what they're trying to say, as Steve does in this beautifully written chapter. I have to say it's a beautifully written chapter. Having in the middle of midterms right now, reading students' papers, I thank you for giving me a break. Commas, folks, commas. But at any rate, so the passage, at lilac evening, I walked with every muscle aching in the Denver colored section, wishing I were a Negro, feeling that the best the white world offered was not enough ecstasy for me, not enough life, joy, kicks, darkness, music, not enough night. Now, I can see why critics would just latch on, even from that first section of this, is because when he talks about a lilac evening, that is a romantic gesture, right? When in literary studies, lilac has a lot to do with romanticism, longing, and nostalgia. So right from the very first words, this is what's going on here. And as we know in Kerouac's, even with the title On the Road, he's looking for something, right? He's trying to find something, and as Steve was saying, what he's trying to find is whatever it is interior, in terms of his interior, what he's trying to find himself, his authentic self. And he's doing this, at least in On the Road, or trying to do this, through sort of this connection to other groups of people, black and brown people, or maybe his Buddhism, right, his foray into Buddhism and that kind of thing. I agree with Steve that that we have to look interiorly. That's the most important thing, to look interiorly first, I think, before trying to go out and trying to connect in that way in order to figure out who we are as people. I read one passage, I believe it was in one of his journals when I was at the Lowell Center for History. Kerouac was reading Carl Jung, and he was reading Freud, and he said they were a bunch of garbage. Right? He's like, they're garbage. And I was thinking, well, I think Kerouac maybe could have used a psychiatrist or a psychologist at the time. Maybe that would have helped you. He's looking for something. But rather than sort of going into this exterior and trying to figure out who he is, and that way he's going outside of himself, which is a great thing, right? We want people sort of this pluralistic idea that people are, that we want to connect with other people. But I think he needed to look inwardly first, right? But then I started thinking about it. He's actually doing both. He's looking outward, but inward at the same time. Outward in his connection, or trying to connect with other groups of people, but also inwardly, right, through the writing. That's where the inward comes from. That's where he is trying to figure out who he is as a person, right? So he goes on to talk about this lilac evening, and then this line here, when he goes, he says, a gang of colored women came by, and one of the young ones detached herself from the mother-like elders and came to me fast. Hello, Joe. And suddenly she saw it wasn't Joe and ran back blushing. Now, to sort of take this section apart, his description of a gang of colored women, right? That's a loaded sort of description of this group of black women, because it does not make them distinct. They're one sort of group of black women, right? And that's one of the issues that a lot of critics have with Kerouac's writing about race, writing about black and brown people, is that in his fiction, he does not give these black and brown characters any interiority. right? We don't know what they think about their lives working in the cotton fields. We don't know what their lives are like at home with their families, right? That's one of the issues with his work, is that he doesn't go far enough. He mentions these black and brown people. We have a girlfriend here, you know, the Mexican woman, but we don't know much about her, right? That would have expanded, I think, and probably would have shut up a lot of the critics if he were able to go a little bit further than just sort of naming these characters. Now, that takes me back to Pick. One of the beautiful things I like about that novel is that even though Kerouac doesn't go far enough, the fact that he actually is extending himself to learn, right, and to write about these two black characters, these two young black male characters, you know, as they are making their way from the Jim Crow South to the north of New York, and eventually they want to move out to New York for a better life, to California for a better life. That Kerouac is actually thinking about race, right? He's actually thinking about the civil rights. He's actually thinking about Jim Crow. A lot of writers of his era were not thinking about Jim Crow and race in the way Kerouac was. And I'm like Steve. I give Kerouac a lot of I'm trying to say credit. That's the word. A lot of credit for actually, you know, sort of sticking his neck out there. Even though the novel was written in 1971, and by the time Kerouac dies in 69? Yeah. He died in 69, that he's become very conservative, right? He doesn't like the hippies, doesn't want the beat movement associated with the hippies, right? He was against those folks who were anti-war. I'm not sure how he felt about the civil rights movement. I think he would have supported it, but I'm not sure, right? I don't know that about his life. But by the time, but by the time this novel is published, you can see, though, even though he might have a much more conservative take about what's happening in the United States in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, you can see him actually writing about and struggling with this notion of civil rights and what it means for African Americans in this country. All throughout Pick, we have the narrator actually pointing out things like segregation, bus segregation, pointing out things like slavery in the Civil War, and writers of his generation just were not doing that. You did not find, well, a lot of them were not. Hemingway, I love Hemingway, right? Absolutely love Hemingway, but he was not concerned about the lives of black and brown people in his novels. In terms of another contemporary, William Faulkner, even though he was a Southerner and was in the midst of everything that was going on in the civil rights movement, right? He was not as progressive as Kerouac, at least not in my opinion. He wasn't as progressive as Kerouac was. And Faulkner's notion that black Americans at that time should just go slow and allow Southerners to catch up with, giving black people full citizenship, or treating black people as full citizens. Faulkner just could not get there. He couldn't get there. But I think Kerouac is headed in that direction, especially with Pick. And I think that's one of the brilliant things I like about that novel, that he actually goes there. When I think about what he's doing in that novel, it seems to me like he gets almost to the finish line, almost get across the finish line, but not quite, right? And what I mean by that is that even though he points out these various discriminatory things that are going on in the novel against Pick and his brother, even though he's pointing these things out, again, we don't have the characters actually reflecting on what it means to have to ride in the back of the bus, right? So there's one scene where Slim, Pick's older brother, once they get out of the South and they're headed into New York, the older brother says, "Hey, now we can sit in the front of the bus, and we're no longer in Jim Crow." And then Pick, the 10-year-old, says, "Don't call me Jim Crow." And he says, "What is Jim Crow?" He said, "You're Jim Crow." And then that's it. There's no more reflection about it. It's like, and that's the end of it. But again, a lot of writers of Kerouac's generation, right, were not even thinking about the United States in those terms. other things that I found fascinating with this chapter is the Poderick's. Poderick's he's an interesting character, a literary social critic, and he did not like Kerouac. He did not like the fact that Kerouac, particularly at the time, that as you've written, he says, taken strictly on his own, Poderick's point certainly has truth to it, but his put down of Kerouac was contained in a sneering look down his nose, as they called the Know-Nothing Bohemians, in which Poderick accused Kerouac and his Beat Generation contemporaries of being the avowed enemies of all that was right, good, proper, and decent about civilized America in the 1950s. Poderick is off, he sees off the wire, right? I don't find that true at all about Kerouac or the Beats. I think one of the issues with Kerouac and the Beats at the time is that a lot of other writers who were putting their lives on the line and words on the page were actually working towards to help African Americans achieve full civil rights in the United States. One of the problems with the Beats, I think a lot of critics look at when they look at the Beats, is that they were not political enough. They were not on the front lines. They were not picketing. They were not writing their legislators, right, about civil rights for African Americans. But they were writing about black people, again, without giving them that kind of interiority, and without looking at how the society or what they were writing about reflected the lives of black people at the time. They weren't really doing black and brown people. They weren't really doing that. But one of the interesting things about Poderick is that he started off very progressive, very liberal in the 50s, and about the 40s and 50s. By the time he gets to the 60s, just like Jack Kerouac, his socio-political sort of the way he thought about society and politics in America sort of flipped, right? He went from the very progressive, sort of looking at the Beats in a negative way, right? Because they weren't progressive enough, to being very conservative. Right? As a matter of fact, Poderick was one of the founders of the neoconservative movement in the United States in the 1970s, right? And like Kerouac, he didn't like the hippies, right? At Kerouac in the 60s didn't like the hippies. He was against those who were against the Vietnam War. Poderick totally switched, right? And so it's fascinating to me to look at Poderick and how he is going after Kerouac for not being liberal enough, not being progressive enough, to actually following the same kind of social and political trajectory that Kerouac followed, that Kerouac took at the time. Some of the other things that I felt were really interesting was that when you talked about the William Levitt and the Levitt towns and the GI Bill. The GI Bill was meant to sort of help African Americans who served this country to have more opportunities. But even within the GI Bill, there were discriminatory practices such as redlining. You mentioned the Levittown houses that said the tenant agrees not to permit the premises to be used occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race. The interesting thing is that Levitt was Jewish. So that, this is a Jewish man who apparently now sees himself as a white man. But at the time, Jews were not seen as white, right? But he's sort of adopted that notion that he is white, and I don't know how people classify themselves, or Jews classify themselves today, but at the time, for him to make the statement that the premises should be used or occupied, should not be used or occupied by any person other than members of the Caucasian race is very ironic to me, given that he was a Jewish man. A few more things that I think is fascinating about Kerouac. Going back to this notion of his giving away that ticket when he gets into Columbia. I always wondered about that. I said, this was a golden ticket for him to become, maybe he wouldn't have become an insurance agent, right? A very successful insurance agent, but he could have done anything with a degree from Columbia. And the reason, I'm still trying to figure out the reason why he decided not to take that ticket, right? I think it's part of his, that counterculture sort of notion that he has. But at the same time, this was an opportunity that a lot of African Americans would not have had, right? So that's another thing that I see that's going on, that Steve has written about here, is that Kerouac has the luxury of giving back the ticket. For a lot of African Americans who would have loved to have gone to Columbia, the ticket wasn't even given to them. The other thing that that's fascinating to me is that, you know, Kerouac goes to Columbia on a scholarship, a football scholarship, and he was recruited for his athletic prowess, but I also think that he was recruited for his intellect. Again, he was one of the most well-read writers of his generation, and I don't think a lot of critics focus on that very much. And so he could have gone anywhere, probably, you know, with his athletic prowess as well as with his intellect. And which brings me to, you know, sort of this question, and maybe some of you can help me out with this. It's like a number of critics, when they think about Kerouac's life, you know, after he leaves Columbia, you know, he is not only, there is a financial precarity, he's always broke, right? Always broke. You know, it's me. Even when, you know, even when he goes to Florida, like, he has a hard time purchasing his house in Florida. And I looked at some of his letters. If it wasn't for, I can't remember, what was his wife's name? Stella. Well, for Stella's, I don't know what, they'd be homeless. They really would have been. I mean, she was like the one who kept all the finances together, and, you know, wrote all the people who owed him money, the publishers and those folks, and kept them sort of solvent. But I was thinking, even if he had dropped out of Columbia, you know, he could have been a really amazing high school teacher, or he could have been a really amazing college professor. Why did he choose not to do that? That way he could have written his novels, and he also could have had an income where he didn't have to worry about that kind of precarity. He was dealing at the end of his life with not only, you know, financial precarity, but physical precarity. He was beaten up pretty good, right? He was having a lot of physical ailments, issues, and psychological precarity. And I think that kind of, you know, if he had chosen a different path, that maybe he would not have suffered as much as he did in the last years of his life. And reading some of his letters, right, the amount of suffering that this man went through was just really moving to me, right? He's still, despite the fact that he is in so much physical and psychological pain because of then his alcoholism and of course occasional drug use, that he still is, he's continuing to write and thinking about writing. And that is an extraordinary thing to me, that he did not give up. Now we talk about the interiority of his life, and you talk about his going home. Home for him, to me, you know, you talk about his going to, Steve talks about his going to New York at the end of his piece. To me, his home was always Lowell, always. Whether he was going to New York, whether he was in California, whether he was in Florida, whether he was in Europe, it was always Lowell. That was the center of his heart, right? That's where he belonged, right? That's where he felt the most Jack Kerouac, as you know, even when he wasn't in Lowell. And so thinking about this notion of home, not only is it Lowell, the way I look at Jack Kerouac, but it was also his writing, because he's constantly going back home through his writing about his brother, writing about his family, writing about Lowell High School. He's constantly returning home, right? And I think we need to, you know, think about Kerouac as, you know, one of the great writers who was able to really give us a sense of what Lowell was like when he was growing up. Just brilliant passages throughout all of his work. And one of the things I found when I was doing research at the Center for Lowell History, you know, the novels and the fictional work, the poetry is brilliant, wonderful stuff. But where you really get a sense of who Kerouac is in the journals, and in the journals and in the letters. Right? The journals really give you a sense of who this man was, what his hopes were, what his dreams were, the difficulties that he was going through, and I would encourage anyone who has not gone to the Center for Lowell History to really take a deep dive into the Kerouac archive. It's just a fascinating trip. And the last thing I want to talk about and then we can have questions, is there's so many. When I was taking notes, I had yes, Steve, you know, and yes, exactly, that's right. Throughout this, Kerouac, when Steve writes, Kerouac's reaching for an identity he could not fully possess was one of the many struggles of the soul and spirit he engaged in throughout his life. And out of that struggle comes one of the many gifts he left for us. He gave us his life, and he gave us the accounts of his life in order that we may see the joys that can be found and the demons that may be encountered as we pursue the who I am questions. That is a brilliant passage about Kerouac, and I wholeheartedly agree, because he has given us his life in these books, these wonderful books, and his poems, and his journals, right, and his letters. He has given that to us to make us, hopefully to prompt us, you know, to think about who we are at this moment in our lives, right, and what Kerouac and what Lowell means to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't we do this? We got a cake over here, got some coffee and water. If you we want to continue the conversation. We want to give you a chance, if you want to grab you a water and a cup of coffee and maybe a piece of cake and bring it back over here. We'll keep it going. Why don't we do that? We'll take about a 5-minute break, and then those of you who'd like to continue this conversation.